The CEO was not sleeping. She was hunting. Catherine Moreau sat motionless in Conference Room C on the 53rd floor of Moreau Global Tower, her head resting on the polished mahogany table, her breathing deliberately slow and rhythmic. Through barely closed eyelids, she watched the reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows that wrapped around the room like a glass cage suspended above Manhattan. The city sprawled below in a carpet of lights, millions of lives unfolding in the darkness, none of them aware that in this glass tower, a woman worth $4.7 billion was playing possum for a janitor. She had learned this trick from her father, Robert Moreau, the man who had built this company from nothing more than a second mortgage and an iron will. He had taught her that true character only revealed itself when people believed they were alone. Board members who smiled in daylight meetings showed their real faces in empty hallways. Executives who praised collaboration sabotaged rivals when the lights went down. And Catherine, who had spent 15 years climbing from junior analyst to CEO, had made it her business to know exactly who people were when the performance ended. Tonight, she was testing the night janitor. His name was Marcus Daniel Hayes, according to the employee database. 34 years old, employed for 14 months through the contracted cleaning service Build Clean. Consistently punctual, no disciplinary issues. The kind of anonymous efficiency that corporate systems loved and corporate leadership ignored. Catherine had never spoken to him, had never really looked at him until last week, when Ryan Foster, her head of security, mentioned something unusual during their weekly briefing. The night janitor on 53 asked about the power consumption reports, wanted to know why certain systems were running during off hours when the floors were supposed to be empty. Most CEOs would have dismissed it. Catherine had built her career on not dismissing anything. She had asked Ryan what he told the man, that it was not his concern, that he should focus on his job. And did he? Ryan had hesitated before answering. He did his job, but he kept looking. Not in a suspicious way, more like concern. Concern. The word had stayed with her for 3 days, circling her thoughts like a vulture over carrion. In a building full of people paid to care about quarterly earnings and shareholder value, the janitor was concerned about systems running in empty spaces. It was either remarkably naive or remarkably observant. Catherine needed to know which. So tonight she had stayed late, dismissed her assistant, turned off most of the lights, positioned herself in the conference room with the glass walls where anyone passing by could see her, and she had waited. The soft squeak of cartwheels announced his arrival at exactly 2:47 in the morning. On schedule. Predictable. Catherine controlled her breathing, kept her face relaxed, her body still. Through the reflection, she watched him approach. Marcus Hayes moved with the economical grace of someone who had learned to navigate spaces without disturbing them. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, lean in a way that suggested hard labor rather than gym memberships. His skin was deep brown, his hair dark and close-cropped, practical. His hands, even from this distance, looked weathered and calloused, the hands of a man who had spent years working with tools and timber and machinery. His uniform was clean but worn, the Build Clean logo fading on the chest pocket like a memory losing its grip. He pushed his cart with one hand, the other holding a spray bottle with the casual competence of long practice. He paused outside the conference room, noticing her through the glass wall. Catherine watched his reflection as he stood there, perfectly still, deciding what to do. The easy choice would be to move on, come back later when the room was empty. That was what most people would do. Avoid the complication of a sleeping executive. Pretend you never saw anything, clock your hours, and go home. Instead, he carefully opened the door. The quiet click of the latch seemed loud in the silence. Marcus entered slowly, his movements even more careful now, clearly trying not to wake her. Catherine maintained her facade of sleep, tracking his approach through the window's reflection and the subtle awareness of his presence in the room. He did not start cleaning immediately. She heard him set down the spray bottle, heard the soft rustle of fabric. Then she felt it, the weight of something being draped gently across her shoulders. A jacket. His jacket. Worn denim still warm from his body, smelling faintly of laundry detergent and honest work, and something else she could not quite identify. Care, perhaps. The scent of someone who still believed in small kindnesses. What happened next would stay with Catherine for the rest of her life. His voice came barely above a whisper, so quiet she almost missed it. Words meant for no one in this room. Words meant for a ghost. "I'm sorry I couldn't keep you warm, Sarah. But I can keep her warm. I promise. No one should be alone in the cold. Not again. Never again." The words hit her like a physical blow. There was something in his tone that went beyond sadness, beyond grief. It was a vow carved into bone, a promise that had become the architecture of his entire existence. He was not talking to her. He was talking to someone who was not there anymore. Someone he had failed to protect. Catherine's carefully maintained composure nearly cracked. She wanted to open her eyes, wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to understand what tragedy had carved that kind of promise into a man's soul. But she held still, barely breathing, as Marcus moved away. She heard him cleaning, the soft spray of solution, the gentle wipe of cloth on glass, the careful attention to detail that suggested he took pride in work that most people considered beneath notice. He worked around her without making a sound, treating her presence with a respect that felt almost protective, like she was something fragile, like she mattered. 15 minutes later, he was gone. The conference room gleamed. The jacket remained on her shoulders. Catherine sat up slowly, her heart beating harder than it had during any hostile takeover negotiation. She pulled the jacket closer, feeling the worn fabric, the weight of it, the lingering warmth. In the pocket, she found a small photograph, bent at the corners from being carried close to someone's heart for too long. A woman with kind eyes and a little girl with ribbons in her hair. On the back, written in careful print, "Sarah and Sophie Hayes, Maine, 2021. 3 years ago." Catherine stared at the photo, at the woman who was clearly gone, at the child who would be older now, and something shifted in her chest. Something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Something that felt dangerously close to recognition. She had built her empire on reading people, on understanding motivation, on knowing exactly what drove human behavior. She understood greed. She understood ambition. She understood fear and pride and the desperate hunger for success. But this quiet vow to a ghost, this promise to protect strangers from a cold he could not protect someone else from, this she did not understand at all. Catherine stood, still holding the jacket, and walked to the window. Below, the city sprawled in its carpet of lights. Millions of people living millions of stories she would never know. Somewhere down there, Marcus Hayes was probably heading home to his daughter, carrying the weight of a promise that seemed to govern his entire life. And up here in her glass tower, Catherine realized she had just discovered something far more valuable than efficiency ratings or clean floors. She had discovered someone who still believed in promises. By 7:30 the next morning, Catherine was back in her office, the photograph from Marcus's jacket on her desk. She had not gone home, had not slept, had spent the hours since the conference room incident sitting in the darkness, trying to understand why a janitor's whispered promise to a dead wife had unsettled her so completely. She called Ryan Foster. "I need everything you can find on Marcus Hayes, the night janitor. Where he came from, why he's here, what he was before this." Ryan appeared in her doorway 20 minutes later, his expression already guarded. With respect, Ms. Moreau, he's a contract employee. His background check was clean. He does his job. That's all we need to know. No, that's all we bothered to know. There's a difference. She watched Ryan process this, saw the moment he decided to take her seriously. He pulled out his phone, accessing the personnel files. Marcus Hayes, hired 14 months ago through the standard service company we contract with. Previous employment was construction work in Maine. Some general maintenance after that. No college degree. References checked out. Lives in a rent-controlled apartment in Queens with a 6-year-old daughter. Single father. Wife deceased. How did she die? Ryan looked up, surprised by the question. I don't have that information. We don't typically dig that deep for janitorial staff. Then dig deeper. I want to know everything about this man by the end of the day. After Ryan left, Catherine turned to her window and watched the city wake up below. She was 45 years old. She had been CEO of Moreau Global for 8 years, had guided the company through 2 recessions and 3 hostile takeover attempts, had built a reputation as one of the most formidable executives of her generation. She had sacrificed her marriage for this company, had chosen boardrooms over nurseries, had accepted loneliness as the price of power. And now, a janitor with a dead wife and a worn jacket had somehow gotten under her skin in a way that no competitor, no board member, no market crash ever had. Her phone buzzed. James Blackwell, her CFO, reminding her about the Apex Technologies meeting at 10. The acquisition was entering its final phase, a $3.2 billion deal that would double their market share and cement her legacy. She had spent 18 months engineering this merger, had outmaneuvered 3 competitor bids, had negotiated terms that would make her board members weep with joy when the announcement went public next month. But as she gathered her files and prepared for the meeting, she kept thinking about the photograph in her desk drawer, about Sarah and Sophie Hayes in Maine, about a man who noticed systems running when buildings should be empty and could not look away because a promise he had made to a ghost would not let him. The file on Marcus Hayes arrived on her desk at 6 that evening, thick enough to suggest Ryan had taken her instructions seriously. Catherine closed her door, dimmed her lights, and began to read. What she found was a tragedy in 3 acts. Act 1 was a career. Marcus Hayes had spent 10 years working construction in Maine, rising from apprentice to journeyman to foreman by the time he was 28. He had supervised crews of 15 men, had earned a reputation for spotting problems before they became catastrophes. March 2021. He had once noticed a hairline crack in a steel beam on the 12th floor of a building under construction in Portland. The contractor, Harold Brennan of Brennan Construction, had screamed about deadlines and penalty fees. 2 days later, an engineer confirmed that the beam would have collapsed under the weight of the concrete they were planning to pour. Marcus had saved at least 8 lives that day. Act 2 was a fall. The same contractor who had been humiliated by Marcus's caution found ways to retaliate. Dangerous assignments, impossible deadlines, the kind of subtle persecution that could not be proven but could definitely be felt. On a February afternoon in 2021, Marcus was working on scaffolding 8 stories up on another Brennan project when something went wrong. The official report blamed high winds and equipment failure. The unofficial truth, according to 3 witnesses Ryan had tracked down, was that everyone on that site knew the scaffolding had not been properly secured. And everyone knew why. Marcus fell 80 feet. He broke 3 vertebrae in his lower back. He spent 3 months in a hospital learning how to walk again. Act 3 was a death. Sarah Hayes, 31 years old, had been driving to visit her husband on a night when black ice covered the roads outside Portland. Marcus was unconscious from pain medication, sleeping through the first peaceful rest he had found in weeks of agony. Sarah called him 3 times from the car. trying to let him know she was on her way. He never answered. She lost control on Route 26, slid across the center line, struck a tree. The coroner estimated she had been alive for almost 47 minutes after the impact, trapped in the wreckage, alone, in temperatures that dropped to 9 degrees below zero. By the time anyone found her, she had been dead for 6 hours. Catherine set down the file and stared at the wall of her office, at the photographs of her father and the awards from business magazines and the framed certificates that documented her ascent. She thought about Marcus Hayes waking up in a hospital bed to learn that his wife had died alone in the cold while he slept, and she understood, finally, why he whispered promises to ghosts. The rest of the file documented the aftermath: medical bills totaling over $180,000, funeral expenses, zero income for months while Marcus struggled through rehabilitation. He lost their house within 6 months. He and Sophie, then 3 years old, spent 4 months in a homeless shelter in Portland before Marcus managed to find work and scrape together enough for a security deposit on the cheapest apartment he could find in Queens. There was a note from a social worker who had observed him during those months at the shelter. Marcus Hayes demonstrates an almost pathological commitment to helping others, often at the expense of his own well-being. He has been observed giving away his own meals and clothing to other residents, particularly those with children. Recommend monitoring for self-destructive tendencies masked as altruism. And there was a statement from the shelter director included in the file like an afterthought. During a group meeting, Mr. Hayes stood and made what he called a promise to his late wife. He vowed that he would never let anyone suffer alone if he could prevent it, that he would pay attention when others looked away, that he would care even when caring cost him. Several other residents were moved to tears. I have worked in this field for 20 years, and I have never seen someone express such raw and genuine commitment to a principle. Catherine closed the file and sat in the darkness of her office, thinking about promises, about the one she had made and the one she had broken, about her father, who had built this company on integrity and passed it to her with the expectation that she would protect what mattered, about her mother, who had died believing Catherine was the only one who would not let the company become something they would have hated, about all the compromises she had made along the way, all the small surrenders she had justified as necessary, all the times she had chosen convenience over conviction and told herself it was just business. A janitor who gave his jacket to strangers and whispered promises to ghosts had somehow exposed every crack in the armor she had spent 45 years constructing. She reached for her phone and called Ryan Foster. "I need you to pull the power usage reports for the building mechanicals. Everything from the past 6 months. Focus on floors 48 through 51. The reports arrived at 7 the next morning, delivered by a bleary-eyed Ryan who had clearly been up all night compiling data. Catherine spread them across her desk, comparing power usage against occupancy schedules, against work orders, against the building's automated systems. At first, nothing looked unusual. Normal fluctuations, expected variance, the kind of minor discrepancies that existed in any large building. But then she noticed a pattern, subtle but undeniable once she saw it. Every Tuesday and Thursday night between midnight and 4 in the morning, power usage on floors 48 through 51 spiked by nearly 30%. Not enough to trigger any alarms, not enough to seem suspicious if you were not looking for it, but consistent, regular, deliberate. What's on those floors? Ryan checked his notes. 48 is mostly storage and auxiliary server space. 49 and 50 are being renovated for post-merger expansion. 51 is mechanical systems and building infrastructure. Who has access after hours? During the day, construction crews working on the renovation. At night, just security and maintenance staff. And apparently someone else who doesn't appear on any approved access lists. Catherine stared at the numbers, feeling the first stirrings of something that might have been dread. Schedule an inspection tonight, Thursday. I want to see what's happening in my building when everyone thinks no one is watching. She paused, making a decision that surprised even herself. And I want Marcus Hayes there. He noticed this before anyone else did. I want to know what else he might see. The park in Queens sat at the corner of 43rd Street and 10th Avenue, a small green rectangle surrounded by brick buildings and corner bodegas and the accumulated history of a neighborhood that had seen better days and worse ones and kept going regardless. Catherine arrived in a taxi at 4 p.m, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, carrying none of the armor that protected her in boardrooms and shareholder meetings. She found Marcus sitting on a bench near the climbing structure, watching a small girl navigate the monkey bars with an intensity that suggested the fate of the world depended on her reaching the other side. Sophie Hayes was 6 years old now. The photograph Catherine had found had been taken 3 years ago, before Sarah died. She had her father's dark features and her mother's determined expression, and she moved through the playground equipment with the careful confidence of a child who had learned early that the world could be trusted only so far. Catherine approached the bench. Marcus noticed her, and she watched the moment of recognition cross his face, followed by the realization that she had never actually been asleep. You weren't sleeping, both nights. I was testing you. Marcus accepted this information without visible reaction, though something shifted in his eyes. Testing me for what? To see who you are when you think no one is watching. To understand what kind of person makes promises like the one you made. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to Sophie as she completed her crossing and jumped down from the monkey bars with a triumphant shout. You went through my jacket. Found the picture. Catherine pulled the photograph from her pocket and held it out to him. I needed to understand the things you whispered in that conference room. The promises you were making to someone who wasn't there. I needed to know who she was and why you're still talking to her 3 years later. Marcus took the photograph, his calloused fingers gentle on the worn edges. Sarah wanted me to be better than I was, stronger than I felt. She believed I could be the kind of man who noticed when things were wrong and did something about it. After she died, after everything fell apart, keeping that promise was the only thing I had left. Sophie came running over, her face flushed with triumph, her sneakers leaving prints in the dirt.
Daddy, I made it all the way across without stopping. Did you see?
Marcus's entire demeanor transformed, the careful guardedness falling away like a mask he had forgotten he was wearing. I saw everything, sweetheart. You were amazing. Sophie noticed Catherine for the first time, studying her with the frank curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to hide her assessments. You're really tall. Are you wearing high heels? Mrs. Martinez at school says high heels hurt your feet, but they make you look important. Catherine found herself smiling, a real smile, the kind she had almost forgotten she could produce. No high heels today. I decided to be comfortable instead. That's smart. Daddy says comfortable is better than fancy any day. Your daddy sounds like a wise man. Sophie nodded with absolute conviction. He's the wisest person I know. He notices everything, even the things nobody else sees. Catherine looked at Marcus, who was watching his daughter with an expression that contained entire volumes of love and fear and hope. That's actually why I'm here, Sophie. Because your daddy noticed something important, and I need his help to understand what it means. They walked to a small bodega on the corner, The kind of place that sold ice cream and empanadas and lottery tickets to people who could not afford to dream but did anyway. Sophie got chocolate with rainbow sprinkles and immediately began interrogating Catherine about her job, her apartment, whether she had any pets, whether she liked butterflies, because Sophie was reading a book about butterflies, and they were the most beautiful things in the whole world. Catherine answered each question with the same attention she brought to board meetings, recognizing that this small girl was conducting her own form of due diligence. When Sophie ran off to chase a pigeon, Marcus turned to Catherine with something that might have been gratitude. Most adults treat her like an inconvenience, something to be tolerated until the real conversation can happen. You actually listened to her. She's remarkable, observant and direct, and completely unafraid to ask for what she wants to know. She reminds me of myself at that age, before I learned that asking questions could be dangerous. What changed? Catherine watched Sophie attempting to convince a skeptical pigeon that she meant no harm. I learned that the questions worth asking were the ones people didn't want to answer, and I learned that asking them anyway was the only way to find out what was really happening. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing. You didn't come all the way to Queens just to return my jacket and meet my daughter. No, I came because I think you saw something in my building that everyone else missed. Systems running when they shouldn't be running. Power consumption that doesn't match any authorized activity. And I came because I need to know if you're willing to help me understand what it means. What makes you think I know anything about corporate power consumption? I'm a janitor. I clean floors for a living. You were a construction foreman who shut down a job site because you noticed a crack that a team of engineers missed. You spent 10 years building things and learning how they work, and you've spent 14 months in my building, watching and cleaning and paying attention to details that everyone else considers beneath notice. Marcus looked at his daughter, then back at Catherine. If I help you, if I get involved in whatever this is, my only condition is that Sophie stays protected. Whatever we find, whatever happens, she can't be touched by it. She's already lost her mother. She can't lose anything else. Catherine met his eyes, recognizing the iron beneath the words. Agreed. Your daughter stays out of it completely. Then what do you need from me? Tomorrow night, Thursday. That's when the power consumption spikes. I'm conducting an inspection of the affected floors, and I want you there. I want your eyes on everything we find. Marcus nodded slowly, some internal calculation reaching its conclusion. I get off my regular shift at 7. My neighbor Maria can stay with Sophie until I get back. What time do you want me on 51? After the building empties out. After whoever is using that power thinks no one is watching. They walked back to the playground, where Sophie had given up on the pigeon and was now attempting to climb a tree that clearly had not been designed for climbing. Marcus helped her down with the patient efficiency of a father who had done this 100 times before, and Catherine found herself watching them with something that felt uncomfortably like envy. She had chosen a different path, had decided that children were incompatible with the kind of career she wanted to build, had accepted loneliness as the price of power, and told herself it was worth paying. But watching Marcus with his daughter, seeing the way his entire world contracted to the size of one small girl with ribbons in her hair, she wondered for the first time if the accounting had been accurate. Sophie tugged on her father's hand, her energy finally beginning to fade. Daddy, can we go home now? I'm tired, and I want to show you the picture I drew of butterflies. In a minute, sweetheart. Marcus turned to Catherine one last time. Ms. Moreau, whatever we find tomorrow night, I need you to understand something. I can't look away from problems just because looking at them makes people uncomfortable. That's not how I'm built anymore. If there's something wrong in your building, I'll tell you about it, even if the truth is worse than not knowing. Catherine extended her hand. Marcus shook it with a grip that was firm, without being aggressive. I'm counting on exactly that. She watched them walk away, Marcus carrying Sophie on his shoulders now, both of them silhouetted against the evening light. A father and daughter who had survived the worst thing imaginable and were still standing, still keeping promises, still paying attention to the world, even when the world was not paying attention back. Catherine thought about her father, about the company he had built, about the legacy he had entrusted to her. She thought about her mother dying slowly in a hospital bed, extracting promises about what kind of leader Catherine would become. She thought about all the years she had spent climbing, achieving, accumulating power and influence, and the respect of people who would abandon her the moment she stopped being useful. And she thought about a janitor who gave his jacket to strangers and whispered promises to ghosts, who noticed things that everyone else had learned to ignore, who could not look away from problems because a dead wife and a living daughter and an unbreakable vow would not let him. Tomorrow night, she would find out what was hiding in the shadows of her own building. Tomorrow night, she would learn whether the success she had spent her life building was real or just an elaborate performance staged over a foundation of lies. But tonight, walking back through Queens to find a taxi that would return her to Manhattan, Catherine Moreau felt something she had not felt in years. Something that might have been hope. Something that might have been the first stirring of a conscience she had thought she had permanently silenced. She thought about a promise she had made to her father before he died, standing in the same city, looking up at the building that bore their name. She had promised to run the company the way he had built it, with integrity that mattered more than profit, with truth that could not be purchased or buried or explained away. She had been breaking that promise for years, one small compromise at a time. But maybe, with the help of a man who still believed in promises, she could start keeping it again. The night was waiting. The truth was hiding somewhere in those dark floors. And Catherine Moreau, CEO of a $4 billion empire, was going to find it with a janitor as her guide. Because sometimes the people who saw most clearly were the ones who had nothing left to lose. The inspection began at 11 on Thursday night, when Moreau Global Tower had emptied of everyone except the ghosts that inhabited all buildings after dark. Catherine waited in the corridor on the 48th floor, dressed in clothes that suggested she had no intention of sitting behind a desk. Dark slacks, a fitted jacket, sensible shoes that would not echo on concrete. Ryan Foster stood beside her with two building engineers, their expressions tight with a particular tension of people who sensed they were about to discover something they would rather not know. Marcus arrived exactly on time, still wearing his janitor uniform, pushing his cleaning cart with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. Behind him came Walt Morrison, the head of night security, a man whose bulk filled the doorway of the security station, his eyes sharp with a kind of alertness that never fully dimmed, no matter how many years passed. Walt was 62, with white hair and the weathered solidity of someone who had seen enough of the world to know its weight, and had decided to carry it anyway. He had been a detective with Boston PD for 25 years before coming to Moreau Global, and on nights like this, it showed. The auxiliary server room on 48 confirmed what the power reports had suggested. Temperature readings showed the equipment running significantly hotter than normal. Processors engaged in calculations that had nothing to do with backup systems or routine maintenance. One of the engineers crouched beside a server rack, his face illuminated by the blue glow of diagnostic displays. Someone's been running distributed processing through these systems. Heavy computational work, the kind you'd use for financial modeling or complex simulations. This isn't backup activity. This is active work being performed without authorization. Catherine absorbed the information, her mind already racing through possibilities. What kind of financial modeling requires this level of processing power? The engineer shrugged, but the implications hung in the air like smoke. Acquisition analysis. Risk assessment. The kind of number crunching you'd do if you were trying to manipulate projections on a major deal. They moved to the 49th floor, where construction materials and renovation equipment filled the corridors like obstacles in a maze. Catherine had authorized the expansion months ago, preparing office space for the post-merger integration that would follow the Apex acquisition. The work was supposed to be proceeding on schedule, and the regular reports from the construction supervisor suggested nothing unusual. Marcus stopped at a corner near the back of the floor, behind a sheet of plastic marked with demolition warnings. His attention had fixed on something at floor level, a detail so small that no one else had noticed it. This electrical outlet was installed recently. The housing is still white. No dust accumulation, no wear marks. And the wiring runs into the wall rather than out of it. Catherine moved closer, studying the outlet with new attention. What does that mean? It means someone installed this to power something behind this wall, something that wasn't part of the original construction plans. Ryan signaled to the engineers, and together they carefully removed the plastic sheeting. Behind it, what should have been an exterior wall waiting for demolition was actually a false partition concealing a hidden space. The room measured perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, carved out of what had been planned as storage area. It contained a desk with a computer setup, a small refrigerator, and a folding cot that suggested someone had spent considerable time here. Empty coffee cups and food wrappers littered the surface of the desk. A filing cabinet stood against one wall, its drawers slightly open, as if whoever had been here last had left in a hurry or simply stopped caring about concealment. Walt let out a low whistle. Someone built themselves a secret office right under everyone's noses. Catherine approached the computer, her hands steady despite the alarm bells ringing in her mind. The screen woke at her touch, revealing files and folders that should never have existed. Financial models for the Apex acquisition, but not the version she had approved. These projections showed different numbers, optimistic forecasts that painted Apex as far more valuable than any legitimate analysis would support. The filing cabinet contained physical documents that made the betrayal concrete. Internal memos marked confidential. Strategic plans that had never left the executive suite. Communication records with an external company called Silvercrest Capital, their primary competitor, the firm that had tried 3 times to acquire Moreau Global and failed each time. Catherine recognized the handwriting on several of the documents, recognized the signature at the bottom of payment authorization forms, recognized the careful, methodical approach to deception that characterized everything James Blackwell did. Her CFO, the man she had trusted for 14 years, the man who had helped her father build this company and had stayed on to serve the daughter. He had been selling them out to their worst enemy while smiling in board meetings and assuring everyone the numbers were solid. Ryan was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the authorities. This is evidence of securities fraud, corporate espionage, and probably a dozen other crimes I can't name off the top of my head." Catherine stopped him with a raised hand. "Not yet. I want to know the full scope of this before we involve anyone outside this room. I want to know how deep it goes." She turned to Marcus, who had been examining the room with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "You noticed the outlet. You saw what the rest of us missed. What else do you see?" Marcus moved slowly through the space, his eyes cataloging details that others overlooked. Whoever used this room spent a lot of time here. The cot has been slept on regularly. You can see the wear patterns in the mattress. The coffee cups are from at least 3 different vendors, which suggests multiple visits over months rather than a single intensive period. And the computer has been accessed on a schedule, probably the same nights the power consumption spiked. Tuesday and Thursday nights. Catherine's voice was flat, the tone of someone processing information that changed everything. James was here every Tuesday and Thursday, building his case for betraying the company while the rest of us were home sleeping. Walt stepped forward, his experience as a former detective evident in the way he approached the evidence. "Miss Moreau, In my experience, operations like this rarely involve just one person. Someone had to help him access the building systems without triggering alerts. Someone had to look the other way when questions were asked. Catherine thought about David Porter, her COO, about his assurances that the Apex deal was clean, about his 10 years of loyal service and his careful avoidance of anything that might rock the boat. She did not want to believe it, but the evidence in this room suggested that wanting and reality were very different things. Marcus pulled a document from the filing cabinet, his expression darkening as he read. Ms. Moreau, you should see this. The document was dated 6 months earlier, a memo between James and someone identified only by initials, DP. The content was damning. References to adjusting valuations, coordinating with Silvercrest executives, ensuring that certain board members remained uninformed until the deal was too far along to stop. DP. David Porter. Catherine felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The architecture of trust she had built over a decade, collapsing in real time. Marcus was studying another set of documents now, his construction background evident in the way he analyzed structural details most people would ignore. There's something else. These renovation plans, the ones filed with the city, they don't match what's actually been built. Someone submitted false documents to the building inspector. That's not just corporate fraud. That's criminal violation of safety codes. He pointed to specific discrepancies. This office shouldn't exist according to the fire marshal's records. No sprinklers, no emergency lighting, no occupancy permit. If there had been a fire and someone was in here, they'd have died. Your CFO endangered lives for his scheme. Catherine processed this new dimension of the betrayal. James had not just stolen money. He had put people at risk. He had compromised the structural integrity of a building where 3,000 employees worked every day. Ryan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face paling. Ms. Moreau, we have a problem. Fire alarm just triggered on 51. Mechanical room. Smoke detected. They ran. The stairwell echoed with their footsteps, Catherine refusing to wait for elevators, her lungs burning by the time they reached the 51st floor. Smoke hung in the air, thick enough to require the breathing equipment that firefighters were already distributing as they arrived. Through the haze, she could see flames licking at computer equipment in the mechanical room. Deliberate, targeted destruction. And there, hunched over a workstation, desperately trying to erase files before they could be recovered, was David Porter. The firefighters dragged him away from the burning servers. His face was blackened with soot, his eyes wild with the desperation that had stripped away every layer of corporate polish. I told James this was a mistake. Burning the evidence only makes it worse. But he's going to be arrested, and he wanted me to clean up. He wanted me to make sure that if he goes down, the trail stops with him. Catherine watched as her COO of 10 years was led away, thinking about shared lunches and strategy sessions and late nights preparing for presentations. Thinking about all the moments when David could have spoken up and had chosen silence instead. Thinking about how easy it was to convince yourself that loyalty to your career was the same as loyalty to your conscience. The fire suppression systems had limited the damage, but the intent was clear. David had been trying to destroy the digital records that connected James's fraud to Silvercrest Capital, the proof that the entire Apex acquisition had been engineered to benefit Moreau's competitors at the expense of its shareholders. Walt approached Catherine as the firefighters finished their work. I've been doing this job 6 years. Before that, 25 years, Boston PD. I've seen a lot of corruption, but this is organized, systematic. Your CFO didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray the company. He's been planning this for years. How do you know? Because I've been keeping logs too. 6 years of suspicious activities, things I was told to handle quietly, things I was ordered to forget. He pulled out his phone, showing Catherine a series of time-stamped photographs and notes. James Blackwell entering this building at odd hours, meetings with people who weren't on any visitor logs, deliveries to floors that were supposed to be empty. I documented it all because 25 years as a cop taught me that patterns matter. And this pattern has been building for a long time. Why didn't you report it? I tried. 3 times. Each time I was told to mind my own business, threatened with termination if I kept asking questions. I'm 8 months from pension, Ms. Moreau. But if you're building a case that might actually stick, I'm in. Pension be damned. Marcus had been quiet during this exchange, studying the burned equipment with the analytical focus of someone solving a technical puzzle. Ms. Moreau, the fire was set to destroy specific servers, not the whole room, just the ones that would have contained communications records. Whoever planned this knew exactly which machines to target, which means James gave David very specific instructions, which means James knew we were getting close. Catherine's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered, putting it on speaker so the others could hear. Catherine? I assume by now you've found my office. James Blackwell's voice was calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing quarterly projections rather than corporate espionage. I found your fraud, James. Your hidden office. Your communications with Silvercrest. Your payoffs. And I found David trying to burn the evidence. A pause on the other end of the line. David was always weak. I told him destroying evidence would only make things worse. But he panicked when he realized you were investigating. Why, James? 14 years. You helped build this company. Why betray it? Catherine could hear something that might have been a bitter laugh. Build it? I was passed over twice for positions I deserved. Your father chose loyalty over competence. He promoted people who smiled and agreed rather than people who challenged him. I spent 14 years watching less qualified executives get credit for my work. So when Silvercrest approached me 5 years ago with an offer, yes, 5 years, Catherine, not 6 months, I decided it was time to get what I was owed. You decided to steal from shareholders, from employees who trusted you. I decided to take what the market would bear. Silvercrest was willing to pay me $4.2 million over 3 years to ensure Moreau overpaid for acquisitions, to weaken the company so they could eventually buy us at a discount. It was just business. People's retirement funds are not just business. Catherine's voice had gone cold. This conversation is being recorded, James. Everything you just said will be used against you. Another pause. I assumed this much, which is why I'm calling from a location you won't be able to trace. I'll be gone before you can involve the authorities. But I wanted you to know, this wasn't personal, Catherine. It was simply the logical outcome of a system that rewards greed over integrity. Your father built this company on a lie, the belief that doing the right thing mattered. I proved it doesn't. The call disconnected. Ryan was already on his phone, trying to trace the number. Walt was coordinating with building security to review all exit footage. But Catherine stood motionless, staring at the burned servers, thinking about what James had said. Your father built this company on a lie. Marcus approached, his voice quiet enough that only Catherine could hear. He's wrong, you know. Your father wasn't lying. Doing the right thing does matter. It just costs more than most people are willing to pay. How would you know what my father believed? Because I met him once. 3 years ago, at that homeless shelter in Portland. He was there doing some kind of corporate charity visit. He talked to me for 20 minutes about construction, about building things that lasted. He said the foundation was the most important part. If you cut corners there, everything else would eventually collapse. Marcus gestured to the burned room. Your CFO cut corners, built his fraud on a foundation of lies. And look, it's collapsing right now. Your father was right. Doing the right thing costs more, but it's the only thing that lasts. The emergency board meeting convened at 6 the following morning. 17 directors assembled around the mahogany table in the main conference room, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock and anger and calculation. Catherine presented everything: the hidden office, the falsified models, the connection to Silvercrest Capital, the complicity of both her CFO and COO, the attempted destruction of evidence. Walter Pemberton, the 73-year-old chairman who had been friends with Catherine's father, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of someone who had watched this company grow from nothing and was now watching it tear itself apart. You're telling us that 2 of our most senior executives have been working with our primary competitor to manipulate a $3 billion acquisition, and that this conspiracy has been active for 5 years? That's exactly what I'm telling you. Margaret Holloway, Maggie to those who had known her long enough to dare familiarity, leaned forward. At 68, she had been on this board for 20 years, had opposed Catherine's appointment as CEO 15 years ago, and had voted against nearly every major initiative Catherine had proposed since. Her voice was sharp, precise, designed to cut. And you expect us to believe that you had no knowledge of this? That your CFO and COO were committing fraud under your nose, and you noticed nothing until a janitor asked questions? I noticed when someone without credentials and corporate politics clouding his judgment asked why systems were running that shouldn't be running. I noticed when I stopped accepting convenient assurances and started looking for uncomfortable truths. Maggie's expression remained cold. The optics are devastating, Catherine. Our stock will plummet when this becomes public. Institutional investors will call for your removal. You've presided over the most catastrophic breach of governance in this company's history. I've presided over the discovery and prevention of that breach. I could have ignored the janitor's observations. I could have accepted James's assurances and David's loyalty. Instead, I investigated. I acted. And I stopped a fraud that would have cost this company nearly $2 billion in the first year alone. The vote to cancel the Apex acquisition passed 10-7, with the minority arguing that the evidence might be fabricated, that pulling out of the deal would damage the company more than completing it. Catherine watched the hands rise and fall, knowing that every vote against cancellation was a vote for willful blindness. But then came the second vote, the one that mattered more. Walter Pemberton cleared his throat, the sound carrying decades of board meetings and corporate battles. Directors, we must now address the question of leadership. Given the circumstances, a motion has been made to request Catherine Moreau's resignation as CEO, effective within 72 hours. Maggie Holloway stood. I'll speak plainly. Catherine's leadership has been compromised. Whether through negligence or complicity, she allowed fraud to flourish for 5 years. The company needs new direction. I move for her immediate removal. The debate that followed was brutal. Directors who had supported Catherine for years suddenly found reasons to question her judgment. The fraud had happened on her watch. The optics were terrible. Shareholders would demand accountability. The press would crucify them if they did nothing. Catherine sat silent through most of it, watching people she had worked with for a decade choose self-preservation over principle. Finally, Marcus Hayes stood up from where he had been sitting quietly in the back of the room. Ryan Foster tried to stop him. This was a board meeting, not open to staff, but Walter Pemberton raised his hand. Let him speak. He's the one who found the fraud. He's earned the right to be heard. Marcus walked to the front of the room, still wearing his janitor uniform, still looking like someone who had no business addressing a board of directors. But his voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. I'm Marcus Hayes. I clean your floors at night. I'm not an executive. I don't have an MBA. I barely finished high school because I was working construction to help my family. So I'm probably the last person who should be talking to you right now. He paused, looking directly at Maggie Holloway. But I'm going to talk anyway, because someone needs to say what everyone in this room already knows, but doesn't want to admit. The room was silent. You're not angry at Ms. Moreau because she failed to catch the fraud. You're angry because she succeeded. Because a janitor noticed something you all should have noticed. Because it took someone from the bottom of your corporate ladder to see what was happening at the top. And that makes you look bad. Maggie's face flushed. You have no right to speak to this board that way. With respect, ma'am, I have every right, because I'm the one who spent 6 months documenting this fraud, while you all collected your board fees and looked the other way. I'm the one who noticed power consumption patterns that should have triggered questions years ago. I'm the one who found the hidden office that your security and your facilities management and your internal audit all missed. He placed a folder on the table. This contains 237 pages of documentation, power logs I kept personally, photographs I took with my own phone, analysis I did on my own time. Every page is dated, time-stamped, cross-referenced. I didn't do this because I wanted to embarrass anyone. I did it because my wife died 3 years ago, and before she died, she made me promise something. Marcus's voice caught slightly, but he continued. She made me promise I would never look away from wrong just because seeing it was inconvenient. Just because speaking up might cost me something. She died alone in the cold because I wasn't there to help her. I can't fix that. But I can make sure other people don't suffer because someone chose convenience over truth. He turned to face the full board. Ms. Moreau could have ignored me, could have told her head of security to fire me when I started asking questions, could have buried this fraud and let the Apex deal go through and blamed the losses on market conditions 2 years from now. Instead, she investigated. She believed a janitor over a CFO. She risked her reputation and her position to find the truth. And now you want to remove her for that? Walter Pemberton was watching Marcus with something that looked like respect. Mr. Hayes, what would you suggest we do? I'd suggest you ask yourselves what kind of company you want to run. One where people are rewarded for finding problems, or one where people are punished for making executives look bad? Marcus picked up his folder. I'll be outside if you need me, but I'll tell you this. If you remove Ms. Moreau, I'm taking this documentation to every business publication in New York. Because the story isn't that fraud happened. The story is how you responded when someone exposed it. He walked out. The board voted 20 minutes later. 9 votes to remove Catherine as CEO. 8 votes to retain her. Catherine had lost by a single vote. Walter Pemberton delivered the verdict with the gravity of someone who had watched this company grow from nothing and was now watching it choose fear over courage. Catherine, the board has voted to request your resignation. You have 72 hours to comply voluntarily. If you refuse, we will proceed with formal termination proceedings. Catherine gathered her notes, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. I will not resign for telling the truth. And if this board removes me for stopping fraud, then you should be certain you can explain that decision to yourselves in 20 years, because I won't be the one living with it. She walked out of the conference room and down the long corridor to her office, past the photographs of her father and the awards that documented her achievements, and the empty spaces where her future had been planning to unfold. 72 hours. Marcus was waiting outside her office when she arrived. Behind him stood Walt Morrison and Ryan Foster, the only 3 people in the building who had stood with her when it mattered. We heard. Walt's voice was gruff, decades of police work making emotion difficult. I'm sorry, Miss Moreau. You deserved better. Catherine sank into her chair, suddenly exhausted. Deserving has nothing to do with it. The board chose self-protection over truth. They'd rather sacrifice me than admit they failed to catch a fraud that was happening under their noses for 5 years. Marcus stepped forward. You have 72 hours. What are you going to do? Catherine looked up at him, this janitor who had noticed an electrical outlet, who had kept meticulous logs, who had spoken truth to power in a boardroom full of people who made more in a day than he made in a year. I'm going to find out exactly how deep this goes. James's phone call, he said this wasn't personal, that it was the logical outcome of the system. But there's something else. Something about my father, about the way this company was built. I'm going to find out what he meant. And if you can't find anything in 72 hours, then I lose everything. But at least I'll lose it knowing I told the truth. Margaret Holloway arrived at Catherine's penthouse unannounced at 9 o'clock that evening, carrying a wooden box that looked older than the building itself. 48 hours remained in the 72-hour countdown, and Catherine had spent most of that time excavating 15 years of corporate history, looking for connections she had never thought to question. The woman who had voted against her, who had spent 15 years opposing her at every turn, who had been passed over for the CEO position and had never hidden her resentment, stood in Catherine's doorway with an expression that did not match anything in their shared history. I voted to remove you because I thought you were making the same mistake your mother made. Catherine stepped back, allowing Maggie to enter, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected development. You knew my mother? Margaret Sterling and I were friends for 20 years before you were born. We started at this company together, 2 young women trying to prove we belonged in a world that didn't want us. She was the smartest person I ever met, and the most stubborn, and the only one who ever understood what it cost to be a woman in this industry. Maggie set the wooden box on Catherine's coffee table and sat down without being invited, her movements carrying the weight of someone who had been holding something heavy for far too long. 15 years ago, your mother was dying. Cancer had spread too far to stop, and she knew she only had weeks left. She called me to her hospital bed and asked me to promise her something. She asked me to watch over you, to make sure you didn't lose yourself in the process of running this company. And she asked me to step aside so that Robert could choose you without opposition. Catherine sank into the chair across from Maggie, her understanding of the past rearranging itself around this new information. You gave up the CEO position because my mother asked you to? I gave it up because Margaret convinced me that you were the only one who would keep this company from becoming everything we hated. She said the others would compromise too easily, would rationalize too quickly, would choose profit over principle when the pressure came. She believed you were different, and you've spent 15 years testing that belief. Maggie's expression shifted, something almost like respect emerging from the lines of her face. I needed to know if Margaret was right about you, if you would bend under pressure or hold your ground. For 15 years, I watched you make compromises I didn't like, decisions I questioned, choices that seemed to prioritize expediency over integrity. And I wondered if Margaret had been wrong. What changed? James Blackwell's fraud, his attempted destruction of evidence, and the fact that when everything fell apart, you didn't try to cover it up or explain it away. You stood in front of the board and took responsibility for what happened under your watch, even though you were the one who stopped it. You chose to believe a janitor over a CFO with 14 years of service. That choice told me everything I needed to know. Maggie opened the wooden box, revealing a stack of letters bound with faded ribbon, handwriting that Catherine recognized from birthday cards and hospital notes, and the last message her mother had ever written. Margaret sent me letters throughout her illness. She wrote about you constantly, about her fears for your future and her hopes for what you might become. And she wrote one letter that she asked me to give you only if I ever became certain that you were the person she believed you could be. Catherine's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope Maggie held out, her mother's handwriting spelling her name in ink that had faded over 15 years of waiting. The letter inside was short, the words of a dying woman who had limited time and unlimited things to say. My dearest Catherine, if you are reading this, then Maggie believes you have become the leader I always knew you could be. That means you have faced something terrible and chosen truth over safety, principle over convenience, integrity over comfort. I want you to know that I chose you not because you were my daughter, but because you were the only one who would not bend. Your father built this company on the belief that success without integrity was not success at all. I need you to protect that belief, even when protecting it costs you everything. The hardest part of leadership is not making difficult decisions. It is living with them afterward. I know you will face moments when the right choice seems impossible, when the price of truth seems too high to pay. In those moments, remember that I believed in you. Remember that some things matter more than winning. I love you. I have always loved you, and I am proud of whoever you have become. Your mother, Margaret. Catherine read the letter 3 times before she could speak, tears falling onto paper that had waited 15 years to deliver its message. She believed in me. Even then, even before I had done anything to prove it, she believed I would not bend. Maggie's voice carried the echo of decades spent watching and waiting. I didn't vote to remove you because I thought you had failed. I voted to see what you would do when everything was taken away, whether you would fight or fold, whether you would cling to the position or stand for the principle. I needed to know if you were really Margaret's daughter. And now I have 3 votes I can change. 3 board members who followed my lead because they trust my judgment. If you can show me that you have a plan to move forward, a way to rebuild what has been damaged, I will bring them to your side. Catherine thought about Marcus Hayes, about his refusal to look away from problems even when looking caused pain, about his promise to a dead wife that had become the foundation of everything he did. I have someone I want you to meet. The meeting happened the next morning in a borrowed conference room in Midtown that had no connection to Moreau Global or its compromised security systems. Maggie arrived first, her skepticism evident in every line of her body. Marcus came directly from his night shift, still wearing his uniform, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had characterized every interaction Catherine had witnessed. Maggie studied him for a long moment before speaking. You're the janitor who noticed the electrical outlet. I'm the person who couldn't look away from something that didn't add up. The janitor part is just how I pay my rent. Catherine explained the situation quickly. The board vote, the 72-hour deadline, the need to demonstrate a path forward that would convince skeptical directors that keeping her was better than removing her. Mr. Hayes has a proposal for how to prevent something like this from happening again. I want you to hear it. Marcus straightened slightly, the unconscious posture of someone preparing to defend something he believed in. The problem with corporate oversight is that it relies on people with power to notice problems that people with power benefit from ignoring. The executives who should be asking questions have careers that depend on not asking them. The board members who should be demanding answers have relationships that make demanding them uncomfortable. The system is designed to catch mistakes from the bottom, not corruption from the top. Maggie's expression shifted from skepticism to something closer to interest. And your solution? Create a parallel system, an anonymous reporting channel where anyone in the company, from the mailroom to the executive suite, can flag inconsistencies without fear of retaliation. Staff it with people who have no stake in the corporate hierarchy, people whose job is specifically to ask uncomfortable questions. Make it report directly to the board, completely independent of executive control. You're describing a professional class of corporate skeptics. I'm describing a system where noticing something wrong doesn't require becoming important enough for your observations to matter. Where a janitor who sees an electrical outlet in the wrong place can report it through channels that will actually investigate instead of dismissing it because the source lacks credentials. Maggie turned to Catherine, her assessment complete. He's not wrong. Every major corporate scandal of the past 20 years happened because people who noticed problems were ignored or silenced. Creating a formal mechanism for that kind of observation could have prevented most of them. That's exactly what I intend to propose to the board. Not just as damage control, but as genuine reform. A way to ensure that what happened with James and David cannot happen again. And what role would Mr. Hayes play in this system? Marcus answered before Catherine could. I don't want a title or an office or a seat at the executive table. I want to keep doing what I've been doing, noticing things that don't add up and telling someone who will listen. If you create this system, you can hire people with degrees and credentials to run it. My contribution was pointing out that it needed to exist. Maggie studied him for another long moment, her expression unreadable. Your mother would have liked him, Catherine. He reminds me of her. Stubborn about principle, unimpressed by hierarchy, willing to sacrifice advancement for integrity. Then you'll support me at the board meeting? I'll do more than support you. I'll make certain you win. The final board meeting convened with 20 hours remaining on Catherine's deadline. 17 directors took their seats around a mahogany table, most of them expecting to witness the formal end of the Moreau family's control over the company Robert had built from nothing. Catherine stood alone at the head of the table, no legal team behind her, no executive allies at her side. The evidence she had compiled over the past 70 hours was arranged in folders at each seat, documentation that told a story far more complex than the one the board had been prepared to hear. She began with the numbers, the language they all understood best. Financial analysis showing that the Apex acquisition, had it been completed, would have cost the company an estimated $1.8 billion when the fraud was eventually discovered. Projections demonstrating that the decision to cancel, while painful in the short term, had protected shareholders from catastrophic losses that would have dwarfed the current stock decline. The damage we have suffered is approximately $500 million in market value. The damage we avoided is more than 3 times that amount. I didn't destroy this company by canceling the acquisition. I saved it. Maggie Holloway spoke next, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been in this room longer than most of the current directors had been in business. I have opposed Catherine Moreau on many occasions over the past 15 years. I have questioned her judgment, challenged her decisions, and voted against her initiatives when I believed she was wrong. But I have never questioned her integrity. And the evidence presented here demonstrates that her integrity is exactly what protected this company from disaster. 2 other directors, longtime allies of Maggie who had followed her lead in the original vote, announced their changed positions. The mathematics of the room began to shift. Catherine presented the reform proposal next, outlining the anonymous reporting system, the independent oversight mechanism, the structural changes designed to prevent future betrayals from taking root. She described how the idea had originated not with expensive consultants or seasoned executives, but with a night janitor who had refused to accept that noticing problems was above his pay grade. The person who saved this company was not someone with an MBA or a corner office. He was someone who believed that paying attention to details mattered more than respecting hierarchies. The system I'm proposing will ensure that the next person who notices something wrong will have a formal channel for their observations, instead of having to hope that someone in power will take them seriously. The vote, when it came, split the room down the middle. One by one, directors announced their positions. The count seesawed between victory and defeat, 5-4, 6-6, 8-7. Walter Pemberton called for the final tally with the gravity of someone who understood that this moment would define the company's future. 9 votes to retain Catherine Moreau as CEO, 8 votes for removal. Catherine had won by a single vote. The silence that followed felt heavier than the debate that had preceded it. Directors who had voted for removal sat motionless, processing the implications. Directors who had voted to retain her looked relieved but wary, knowing that the margin was too thin for comfort. Walter Pemberton stood, his 73 years evident in the deliberate way he moved. The motion to remove Catherine Moreau as CEO has failed. Ms. Moreau retains her position. The board will now vote on the implementation of the proposed oversight system. That vote passed 12-5. Some directors who had wanted Catherine removed were still willing to support reform. After the meeting, Catherine caught Maggie in the hallway. "Thank you. I know what you risked, changing your vote after 15 years of opposition." Maggie's response was measured, careful. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for Margaret. She asked me to make sure you became the leader she believed you could be. Today, you proved her right. Don't make me regret it." The year that followed was a testament to the power of systems designed by people who understood their necessity. The Anonymous Reporting Channel received over 200 submissions in its first 6 months. Most of them were minor concerns that were quickly addressed: equipment safety issues, scheduling conflicts, harassment complaints that had previously been dismissed. Several of them were significant issues that would have grown into major problems without early intervention. The first major success came from an observation submitted by a warehouse worker who noticed inventory discrepancies that did not match the shipping records. Investigation revealed a small but systematic fraud in the procurement department, caught early enough that the damage was measured in tens of thousands rather than millions. The contrast with the James Blackwell situation was obvious to everyone. The same kind of attention to detail that had exposed the CFO's betrayal was now being channeled through formal mechanisms instead of depending on chance. Marcus Hayes accepted a position as Special Advisor for Operational Oversight, a title that sounded important but came with no office, no direct reports, and no requirement to attend meetings in suits. His job was to continue doing what he had always done: walking the building at night, noticing things that others missed, reporting his observations through the same channels available to any other employee. The difference was that now those observations went somewhere, instead of being dismissed as not his concern. He kept his night janitor position as well, refusing offers to move to day shift or supervisory roles. The nights were when the building revealed its true self, when systems operated without performance and people moved without audiences. If he wanted to understand what was really happening in Moreau Tower, he needed to be there when no one thought anyone was watching. The stock recovered gradually, climbing back toward pre-crisis levels, as investors recognized that the company's response to fraud had been exactly what responsible governance should look like. Business publications that had mocked Catherine for trusting a janitor's observations began running features on the innovative oversight system she had implemented, crediting her vision for corporate reform that other companies were beginning to emulate. James Blackwell was arrested 3 weeks after the board meeting, found in a hotel in Cleveland where he had been living under a false name. The trial lasted 4 months. He was convicted on 7 counts of securities fraud and sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. David Porter pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and received 18 months, most of which he served in a minimum security facility. Both men forfeited their pensions and agreed to repay a combined $4.6 million to Moreau Global. Walt Morrison retired at the end of the year, his last shift ending with a small ceremony in the security office where he had spent 6 years watching over the building and the people inside it. Marcus was there, along with Catherine and Ryan Foster and a handful of other employees who had come to understand what the old security guard represented. Walt's final words to Marcus carried the weight of a torch being passed. I spent my whole career watching people get away with things because nobody wanted to make trouble. You proved that making trouble is sometimes the only way to make things right. Keep doing what you're doing, Hayes. This building needs people who can't look away. The connection between Catherine and Marcus evolved slowly, the way trust always does when it is built on something more substantial than convenience. They spoke regularly, professional conversations about building operations and system improvements, but also something deeper, conversations about choices and consequences and the price of living according to principle. Catherine found herself sleeping better. The insomnia that had plagued her for 5 years was finally beginning to release its grip. She did not know if it was the resolution of the crisis or something else, something connected to knowing that there was someone in her orbit who understood what it meant to choose truth over comfort. On a Friday evening in late autumn, Marcus stopped by her office after completing his rounds. The building was quiet, most employees having left hours ago, the kind of silence that invited honesty. The auxiliary system on 32 is running outside normal parameters. Probably just a sensor malfunction, but I wanted you to know. Catherine smiled, a genuine expression that would have surprised anyone who had known her a year ago. I'll have engineering check it first thing tomorrow. Marcus nodded but did not leave, something unspoken hanging in the air between them. Sophie asked about you. Wanted to know why you stopped coming to the park. Catherine felt a pang she had not expected. I didn't want to intrude. You and Sophie have your own life. I didn't think it was appropriate for me to insert myself into it. Marcus's response was quiet but direct. Catherine, you spent a year fighting to save a company because you believed in integrity. You trusted a janitor's observations when everyone told you he was beneath your notice. You moved a stranger's child into your home to keep her safe. You're not intruding. You're the first adult Sophie has met who treats her like a person instead of an inconvenience. A pause. She's also asking questions I don't know how to answer. She wants to know if you're lonely. She says people who are lonely need friends, and she wants to be your friend. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, the armor she had worn for so long suddenly feeling less necessary. I'm not very good at friendship. I've spent so long choosing career over connection that I've forgotten how to let people in. Then maybe you could learn together. Sophie lost her mother before she was old enough to remember what having a mother meant. You lost yourself somewhere along the way to building an empire. Maybe learning how to connect is something neither of you should have to do alone. The silence stretched between them, comfortable rather than awkward, the quiet of two people who had stopped performing and started being present. What would that look like? Learning together? Marcus allowed himself a small smile. It would look like Sunday lunch at our apartment. Sophie's practicing making sandwiches. Her technique is improving, though I can't promise the results will be edible. She wants an important guest to try them. Catherine laughed, a sound she barely recognized as coming from herself. 1 o'clock. I'll bring patience and possibly antacids. The following Sunday, Catherine stood outside a modest apartment building in Queens, holding a bottle of wine that cost more than a month of Marcus's rent, and feeling more nervous than she had before any board meeting or shareholder presentation. Sophie answered the door, her face lighting up with the unfiltered joy that only children can produce. Miss Moreau, you came. I told Daddy you would come. Come see what I made for you. The apartment was small but immaculate, every surface reflecting the care of someone who took pride in maintaining what he had. Photographs of Sarah occupied a place of honor on a bookshelf, a reminder of the woman whose absence had shaped everything that followed. But next to those photographs, Catherine noticed something new. A picture from the park. Marcus and Sophie and Catherine herself, all three of them laughing at something she could not remember. Sophie led her to the kitchen, where a construction paper card waited on the counter, elaborate crayon drawings covering both sides. "I made this for you. Daddy helped with the words, but I did all the pictures myself." Catherine opened the card and found herself looking at a crayon rendering of Moreau Tower, bright windows glowing like stars. At the base of the building stood two figures, one in a business suit, one holding a mop. Above them, in careful letters that Sophie had clearly practiced many times, were words that made Catherine's throat tighten. Two people who keep promises. Sophie explained the drawing with the earnest seriousness of a child sharing something important. "Daddy says you and him work together to keep the building safe. Like heroes in my books, but without dragons. Just grown-ups who do bad things." Catherine knelt to meet Sophie at eye level, holding the card like it was made of precious metal rather than paper and crayon. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. Daddy says you didn't have anyone to make you pictures before, so I decided I would, because everyone needs someone to see them." Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, watching the exchange with an expression that Catherine had never seen on his face before. Something soft, something hopeful. "Sophie's been planning that card for 2 weeks. She wanted it to be perfect. It is perfect. Absolutely perfect." They ate lunch together, sandwiches that were enthusiastically made, if imperfectly constructed. Conversation that ranged from butterflies to business ethics to the best flavor of ice cream. Catherine found herself laughing more than she had in years, found herself relaxing in a way that boardrooms and executive suites had never permitted. After lunch, Sophie insisted on showing Catherine her butterfly book, and the three of them sat on the small couch, Sophie in the middle, turning pages and explaining each species with the authority of a 6-year-old expert. When it was time to leave, Sophie hugged Catherine with the fierce intensity of a child who had decided something important. "You're going to come back, right? Daddy says you're very busy, but I think you should come back." Catherine looked at Marcus over his daughter's head, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "I would like that very much. If it's okay with your daddy." Marcus nodded, something unspoken passing between them. "It's more than okay." That night, Catherine stood at the window of her penthouse, looking out at the city she had conquered and the building that bore her family's name. On the wall behind her, newly framed, hung Sophie's card, positioned next to the photograph of her father that had occupied that space alone for 15 years. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus. Sophie wanted me to tell you that today was the best Sunday she can remember. She asked if you could come back next week." Catherine smiled at her reflection in the glass, at the woman who had spent 45 years building walls and was finally learning to let someone through. "Tell her I'll be there. Same time. And tell her I'm bringing ingredients for cookies. Her sandwiches were perfect, but I think we should expand her culinary repertoire. She's going to be thrilled. Fair warning, she'll probably insist on teaching you rather than the other way around. I'm counting on it." Catherine ended the call and stood in the silence of her expensive, empty apartment, thinking about everything she had gained and lost and found again over the past year. She thought about her mother's letter, about the belief that it waited 15 years to be delivered. She thought about her father's legacy, about the company built on integrity that she had almost lost and had fought to save. She thought about promises made to ghosts and promises made to the living, about the difference between people who bent under pressure and people who stood straight, even when the whole world wanted them to fold. And she thought about a janitor who had given his jacket to a stranger on a cold night, who had whispered vows to a dead wife and kept them for a living daughter, who had noticed an electrical outlet that everyone else had overlooked and had refused to accept that it was not his concern. Some promises were made in boardrooms and contracts, written in legal language and enforced by courts. But the promises that mattered most were the ones made in the dark, when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose. Catherine had spent her life making the first kind of promise. Marcus had taught her the value of the second. The lights of Moreau Tower glowed through the night, a beacon in the Manhattan skyline, standing guard over a city that never slept. Somewhere inside, a night janitor was walking empty corridors, paying attention to details that others dismissed, keeping a promise that had become the architecture of his soul. And somewhere in Queens, a small girl was sleeping with a butterfly book clutched to her chest, dreaming about the tall woman who had listened to her stories and laughed at her jokes and promised to come back next Sunday. Promises were not made for convenience. They were made for the moments when keeping them cost something real. That was when they mattered. That was when they meant anything at all.